My name is Victoria. I am 34 years old. And on a Thursday in November, a number appeared on a television screen behind my father-in-law's head that ended an argument he did not know he had started. I want to tell you about the table first. Because the table is important, the specific fullness of it, the people arranged around it, the way Thanksgiving tables create a particular kind of captive audience that has nowhere to go and no polite way to leave. 14 people. My husband, David, to my left. His mother, Patricia, at the far end. His sister Lauren and her husband. His brother Michael and his girlfriend. Assorted aunts, uncles. A cousin visiting from out of town. The full architecture of a family gathered for a holiday, softened by candlelight and the smells of a meal that had been in preparation since that morning. My father-in-law, Richard, was at the head of the table. Richard was 66 years old. He had built a successful commercial real estate business in Chicago over 40 years, and he carried the weight of that success in the specific way of men who have earned a great deal and have come to believe that earning a great deal is evidence of a particular kind of intelligence that extends beyond the domain in which it was demonstrated. He had never liked me. I want to be direct about this because the story requires it. From the first time David brought me to meet his family, Richard had looked at me with the assessment of a man running a calculation and arriving at an unfavorable result. I was a researcher at a nonprofit. I drove a used car. I had student loans and a studio apartment, and the specific financial profile of a person who had chosen a life organized around something other than income. David's family had money. I did not in the way that Richard understood the word. Richard had made his feelings known over 3 years of family dinners and holidays in a series of comments that were always delivered with the plausible deniability of humor. Jokes about the nonprofit sector. Questions about my career trajectory that were phrased as interest and designed as critique. The specific raised eyebrow of a man who has decided something and periodically reminds you that he has decided it. I had managed all of it. For 3 years I had sat at various tables and absorbed various comments and managed them with the practiced patience of a woman who loves her husband and has decided that engaging is more costly than enduring. And then Thanksgiving. The comment came between the main course and dessert. The specific timing matters. Not the beginning of the meal when people are still arranging themselves, not the end when attention is dispersing, but the middle, when everyone is settled and food has produced a warmth and the wine has been poured twice and Richard had been holding this particular glass for 20 minutes with the slow confidence of a man who has decided to say something. He set the glass down. He looked directly at me. He said, "Let's be honest. She married him for the money. She has nothing of her own." The table went quiet. The specific quiet of 14 people who have heard something that cannot be unheard and are determining what their relationship to it is going to be. My husband, David, looked down at his plate. He said nothing. His siblings looked away. I felt every eye on me, the ones that had the decency to look and the ones that had the decency not to, both of which told me something. I picked up my glass. I took one sip. I set it down slowly. I said nothing. I had decided, in the 3 seconds between his words and my response, that nothing was the correct response. Not because I had nothing to say. Because I had learned, over 3 years of Richard, that arguments with him in front of his family produced one result regardless of what was said. The family arranged themselves behind the man at the head of the table, and I was left with the specific dignity of someone who has argued well and lost anyway. I had nothing to say, and I chose to say it. Then my phone in my cardigan pocket buzzed. A notification from my banking app. I had set it to send daily balance notifications each afternoon at 4 o'clock, a habit from the years when I had needed to monitor my finances closely and that I had never bothered to turn off. I did not reach for my phone. But in the living room, 12 feet from the dining table, the television was still on. I had been using it before dinner to show David's niece a video. I had cast my phone to the screen and had not disconnected before we sat down. The notification pushed to the television. My account balance appeared on the screen, behind Richard's head, in the full view of every person at that table. Someone gasped, then another. Richard turned slowly. He saw the number. His fork stopped midair. His face went completely still. When he turned back to look at me, he could not find a single word. And the table that had gone quiet before went a different kind of quiet now. But before I tell you what actually happened, please like and subscribe to the channel and tell me in the comments where you are watching from. Now, let's begin. I need to tell you what my account balance was. Not the exact number. I am not going to put my exact finances into a story that will exist in the world. But I need to tell you what it represented, because the number, without its context, is just a number. I had worked at the Meridian Research Institute for 9 years. My official title was Senior Research Director. My salary in research nonprofit terms was modest. No one goes into nonprofit research for the compensation. What I had that my salary did not explain was an inheritance. My grandmother, Mei Chen, died when I was 28. She had been a woman who, across 60 years of careful and quiet living, had saved with a consistency and a discipline that her family had not known to observe because she had never drawn attention to it. She had grown up poor. She had spent 60 years making sure she never was poor again. She had told no one, including my parents, what she had accumulated because she believed, with the specific conviction of someone who had learned it from experience, that money that is known is money that attracts claims. When her estate was distributed, I was her sole named beneficiary. Not because I had been her favorite, because I had been the grandchild who had called every Sunday, who had driven 4 hours to visit when the others sent cards, who had sat in the kitchen and listened to her talk about things that mattered to no one else. She had left me in a single lump sum distributed through a trust that had been quietly accumulating for 30 years, an amount that was not modest. I had not told Richard. I had not told David's family. I had not told anyone in David's world, and I had not told them deliberately because the information was mine, and I had watched what Richard's money did to his relationships for 3 years, and I had decided that my money would not do the same thing to mine. I had told David. On our third date, because I had decided early that honesty with David was not negotiable, and because I did not want to build something on a foundation that contained a hidden room. He had sat across from me at a restaurant in Chicago and listened and then said, "Why are you telling me?" I said, "Because if we are going to be serious, you should know all of it. The studio apartment is by choice. I like small spaces." He had laughed. I had loved him for laughing. David had never told his family. At my request. The money was not the foundation of our marriage, and I did not want his family to relate to me through it. I wanted them to relate to me or not on the basis of what they could see. What Richard could see was a woman who worked in a nonprofit and drove a used car and had student loans. He had made his calculation based on what he could see. On a Thursday in November, the rest of the information became visible. The number on the television screen was there for approximately 25 seconds before the notification auto dismissed. 25 seconds is long enough. Long enough for 14 people to read a number and understand its magnitude. Long enough for the specific sequence of comprehension to move around the table. The initial confusion of people trying to understand what they're looking at, then the reading of the number, then the understanding of what the number means. Richard's fork was still midair when he turned back to face the table. He looked at me. He looked at the television, which had returned to the program it had been running. He looked at me again. He was a man who had spent 66 years in environments where information about wealth determined the social architecture of every room he entered. He was a man who understood without being told what that number meant and what it meant that he had not known it and what it meant that his calculation had been made on incorrect information. He said nothing. Not, "I apologize." Not, "I was wrong." Not any of the sentences that the moment might have demanded. He said nothing. He put his fork down. He looked at his plate. Patricia, at the other end of the table, said, "Richard." He did not respond to her either. David's sister Lauren looked at me. Not with any complex expression, just directly. She raised her glass slightly in a gesture that was small and honest and entirely sufficient. David, to my left, reached under the table and found my hand. He had been quiet during the comment. He had looked at his plate. I want to tell you, in this honest accounting of the evening, that his silence in that moment was something we addressed later. Not at the table, not in front of his family, but later, at home, in the specific way that married people address things that need to be addressed. He understood why the silence had been wrong. The conversation was difficult in the way that true conversations are difficult, and it produced something more durable than the version that would have come without the difficulty. He held my hand under the table. That was enough for the table. The rest was for later.
Dessert was served.
The meal continued. The specific machinery of a Thanksgiving table, the passing of dishes, the refilling of glasses, the conversations that reconstitute themselves after disruption, reassembled itself around the table. Richard did not address what had happened. Not that evening. Not to me directly. He addressed it to David 2 days later in a phone call that David relayed to me afterward. Richard had called to say, in the indirect way of a man who does not apologize directly, that he may have been hasty in some of his assessments over the years. David said, "May have been." Richard said, "Was." That was all. Not sufficient, exactly. But real, the closest Richard's specific construction could come to the territory of wrong. I did not require more from him than that. Not because the original comment deserved less accountability, but because I have learned, in 3 years of watching Richard operate, that the ceiling of his available self-reflection is not high and that demanding he exceed it produces diminishing returns. He reached his ceiling. I acknowledged the reaching without applauding it. We have a relationship now that is different from the one before Thanksgiving. Not warm, exactly. More accurate. He looks at me differently, not with the warmth of discovery, but with the adjusted assessment of a man who has recalibrated his information and is operating from the updated version. I will accept that. The original comment was wrong and it was damaging, and the evening around the table produced a correction that I had not planned and did not orchestrate, but that I am not going to pretend was unwelcome. My grandmother kept her money quiet for 60 years because she understood that money that is known attracts claims. She was right. And I had kept mine quiet for the same reason, because I wanted to be known as myself, and not through the number. I was known as myself for 3 years at that table. Richard made his calculation and shared it in front of 14 people. A notification pushed to a television at 4 o'clock on a Thursday afternoon, and the rest of the information was visible. I did not arrange it, but my grandmother, who saved in silence and gave in love and trusted me with what she built, would have appreciated the timing. She had a sense of humor, my grandmother.
So do I.